Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see this wonderful set of students and guests this afternoon, so thank you for being here. Let me welcome all of you to this session on behalf of the director of the School of Economics. I want to start by, of course, thanking our speakers today for their presence and, in fact, commend them for the choice of topics that they bring today to us, discussing issues of social justice and the importance of global action to promote social justice in work-related issues, and also the issue of dignity at work. So congratulations to our speakers today for such thought-provoking topics that they bring to us. Also, please allow me to thank Professor Hermes Costa for his work with this OIT Cátedra, and in fact highlight the connections that this Cátedra has with the PhD program that that the school has with SES on labor relations, social inequalities, and trade unionism. I think there's there a great deal of potential to develop research that is committed to ethic standards in labor relations, in work-related issues, and research that is the basis for sound policy making. And so I think there's a challenge there for the PhD program to continue in a way promoting these topics and feeding into the cátedra that we have here. So I hope if we have some of the PhD students here today that you will feel in a way enticed by the speakers today. And thank you, all of you, for being here, our students and partners in this session. This OIT Cátedra is a key element, I would say, in the internationalization efforts that the school continues to make. We appreciate very much teaming up with organizations and institutions, companies that do their daily work with our societies globally, and so this is a way for us to actually understand better and know better the work that we study here within these walls. So for us it's always very thought-provoking, very stimulating to have these partnerships and to hear firsthand from the people who do the daily job on the areas that we study. So I would ask all of you to take in as much as you can from what you hear today, because this is a key element for us. And finally, just highlight how this partnership is a distinctive feature of the work that we do here at this faculty, an interdisciplinary faculty where we have economics, management, sociology, and IR. And today I think the topics that you have here are probably relevant to all of these areas and can certainly benefit from this interdisciplinary look that we promote here. So thank you everyone for your presence and have a wonderful session.
Thank you, Professor Licínia Simão, Vice Dean of the Faculty. Thank you to the speakers, Dr. Marilena André, Professor Dr. Valentina Beghini, and Dr. Mafalda Troncho from the ILO. It's a pleasure to be here with you. This is the 7th edition of the ILO chair. I would like to just provide a very brief background on this issue. In academic year of 2016-2017, we organized here at FIUC, as a result of a partnership between the ILO, the Center for Social Studies, and the Faculty of Economics, a simulation of International Labour Conference. This was the first simulation organized by the higher institution of education in Europe. And since that event, which basically gathered here at the faculty 300 students, not only from this faculty, but from the old university, we decided to organize, to create, as a result of that initial partnership, to create the ILO chair, Cátedra OIT, which is basically the result, and we create the expectations of changing information between the problems, the elements of discussion provided by the ILO and the interest matters associated with the Faculty of Economics, with its professors and students. So that's why it was created since 2018 the ILO chair. And since then, we have been discussing several topics, and I would like to just remember some of them, some of those topics. Wage report, gender pay gap, for instance, decent work and multilateralism, platform economy, the right to disconnect, inequalities at work, the economy of care, the future of Portuguese automotive industry sector, label child, right to safety and health working conditions, social protection at the crossroads, and last year the issue of ILO's Maritime Labour Convention on one hand and the Labour Global Youth Employment Challenge on the other hand. So we had lots of themes, lots of topics that we have been discussing for the last years. 2 years ago we have organized a book titled precisely ILO Chair Talks on the Future of Work, which is, you can download this book from the website of the University, Coimbra University Press, and it was basically the result of the first talks on the ILO chair. And now we are trying to prepare another book, probably for the next year, precisely joining some of those other conferences from the fourth edition. So I'd like to thank you very much for your presence here. Especially, I would like to thank to our speakers and Dr. Mafalda Troncho, who is the responsible for the ILO office from Lisbon, who will present our speakers. Thank you very much. Of course, we're going to start with the first talk by Dr. Maria Helena André. Then we have open a space for debate, and then we move to the second talk, and also again a space for debate. Thank you.
Vice Dean, Professor, colleagues from the ILO and students, it is with great pleasure that ILO Lisbon joins again the already 7th edition of the chair at the Faculty of Economics of Coimbra University. It is our understanding that this chair is further reinforcing the ties and the relationship between the two organizations, which is very fruitful to both. And actually, it was not with surprise that the University of Coimbra became one of the first universities in the world to join the Global Coalition for Social Justice, and this is one of the subjects that you will hear about shortly. As explained by Professor Herms, who is a very, very close friend to the ILO, this chair follows two very significant events that were held in this university. The first one, the doctorate honoris causa of a former Director General of the organization, Juan Somavia, and the second one was the simulation of the International Labour Conference, and this simulation was the first ever made in the European region, and it's still today well remembered by all of those that participated in it. The chair of this year includes two moments, addressing important areas of ILO's mandate and priorities, and this means that they are related to priorities of the world of work as we know it today. So for this year, we have invited two distinguished colleagues from the ILO that will debate with you first the Global Coalition for Social Justice towards a new social contract, and secondly, upholding dignity at work, the significance of ILO Violence and Harassment Convention from 2019, combating discrimination and promoting safety at work. So I'm extremely grateful to my colleagues, Maria Helena André and Valentina Beghini, that I will now shortly introduce to you. Maria Helena André is the director of ILO Bureau for Workers' Activities since 2013. She has a long career in European trade union movement, where she was Deputy General Secretary in charge of the European Social Dialogue and the negotiations with European employers' organizations. She was also Minister of Labour and Social Solidarity in Portugal and member of the Parliament. Valentina Beghini is a lawyer with a PhD on European and Comparative Legal Studies and over 15 years working experience at the national and international levels, including with governmental agencies, UN, NGOs, and private sector in Europe, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. She has worked extensively on fundamental principles and rights at work, international labor standards, gender equality, and children's rights. She is currently working as legal specialist on violence, harassment, and non-discrimination at the ILO in Geneva. And I will start by wishing you all a fruitful, I will end by wishing you all a fruitful session, thanking the university and the faculty for this relevant partnership and for organizing this chair. And I also want to thank you all for the attendance today.
My turn now. Good afternoon to all of you, Vice Dean, Professor, my colleagues from the ILO, dear students. It's really a pleasure to see a room so full of young faces, and I'm sure that we will be talking about things that may sometimes seem very far away from your daily life at university or even from your daily social life, but which, either you like it or not, will have an impact on your current way of living and on your future. And I've decided to look at what we need to do in order to work towards a new social contract. And I will try to guide us throughout our conversations about where we are on that and where I think we should be. I don't think it should come as a surprise to you if I start by characterizing a little bit the world we live in today. We live in a world today that is characterized by uncertainty. Probably the word that characterizes best the situation we are in is uncertainty. And at the same time, the fact that we are confronted with multiple crises, with growing conflicts around the world. We are seeing a lot of economic shocks and also the economic ramifications of the COVID-19 outbreak. Although it's far away in our memories, its implications in terms of economic and social implications are going to stay with us for a very long time. We also see that our societies are changing at a very, very fast speed, and we now talk about things that are new, not new, that we would characterize as being the long-standing mega trends. And we've talked about globalization, we've talked about new technologies and digital transformation. All of you has a computer in front of you. We are observing and experiencing climate change. But also in our societies, we see a growth in inequalities. And we see, again, a growth in extreme poverty, which tells us that the social contract that we have inherited as a model after the Second World War has become obsolete. It's not giving us what we need as a society today. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to think about a new social contract, and a new social contract that has got to regulate the rights and the duties between the state and its citizens in a more effective manner, but also at the same time, because the national level is no longer enough and relevant, we need to do that at the multilateral and the global level. Antonio Guterres, a compatriot of many of us here in this room, who's the United Nations Secretary General, has been thinking about these things ever since he started his mandate at the UN in ILO, in New York. And when he launched our common agenda, he said, and I quote, that the new social contract between government, people, civil society, business, and more must integrate employment, sustainable development, and social protection based on equal rights and opportunities for all, end of quote. So a big concern from Antonio Guterres on the need for a new social contract. Alongside Antonio Guterres, we also have the ILO Director General, Gilbert Ungbo, who, when he was proposing himself to be elected as Director General of the ILO in 2022, wrote in this vision statement, and I'm going to quote once again, that progress made in the last decades in terms of social justice must be preserved and our common agenda protected, while the global solutions to new challenges and opportunities must be centered around human, environmental, economic, and societal changes. In short, a new global social contract is required. And the discussion about the new global social contract is going to be the topic of the International Labour Conference this year, which is going to start next month in June. Now, if we look at the ILO, which is the oldest organization in the multilateral system, founded in 1919, we already see that social justice was at the heart of the organization. And I'm going to quote again what was written then. All human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, economic security, and equal opportunity. And I think the areas of material well-being and spiritual development are very important in today's world. This was in 1919. And so it was bringing all these elements together that the ILO Director General proposed the launch of the Global Social Justice Coalition. And what do we want out of this coalition as International Labour Organization? Well, what we want is that a key mission of the ILO, which we have since 1919, but which is strengthened today, is on the need that in order to go forward in a constructive manner, not leaving anyone behind, we need to incorporate social justice in all relevant economic, social, and environmental policy decisions that are made at the level of the multilateral system. So we want all the multilateral system organizations to have social justice as one of the key endeavors of the organization, and that to be integrated in the policies and the programs that they develop. And it's very important that we are able to keep a political momentum in this regard, and to do everything we can in order to incorporate the notion of social justice into the international and the national policy making, because this is about bringing all the organizations of the multilateral system with this common objective, but also for that to be replicated, translated into practical action and policies at the national level. And I think that the ILO, with its experience of being a tripartite organization, I'll come back to that, has got the authority to bring these conversations to the front at the global level. Now, what could be the components of this new social contract in the light of the current global challenges that I've told you about from the outset of my intervention? How governments, workers and employers organizations can engage not just in the design, but also in the establishment of this new social contract within the multilateral system, and also at the national level, what are the issues and the policies that we need to discuss? And this is what I'm going to try and concentrate on, not having all the answers to the questions you may have, otherwise I would not be here. But at least trying to make a problematic out of this idea. So I told you the ILO is 105 years old, but it's also the only organization in the multilateral system, so at the international global level, that brings together governments, employers, and workers' organizations in its decision-making bodies. It's unique. There is no other international organization with these characteristics. What do? We set international labor standards, we develop policies, and we devise programs that promote decent work for all. And this is having social justice, tripartism, social dialogue, and collective bargaining at the heart of the actions that this organization pursues. Now, this is not a walk in the park. This is not just you click your fingers and then everything appears. This is also done not just from a national, difficult perspective in many parts of the world, but also on a very complex international setting. And you just need to, well, you don't read newspapers, right? But you click into a social media network, whatever, which one, but you can read every day almost clear attacks on the multilateral system, every day, for all sorts of different reasons. And we also see often, and this is more on the national discussions and not just in Portugal, that social dialogue, having workers, employers and government working together and discussing things together, that's something of the past. That's very old-fashioned. It's a very old-fashioned manner of devising policies. When we hear about how do you increase wages of workers via collective bargaining, no. Today, in the society where I live in and into which I was born, this collective dimension of making things is not something that interests me that much. I mean, I'm much better if I can defend my own interests in an individual manner, and so I can better take care of what I need than to have this collective approach. So this is the type of societies we are in. We can challenge that, we can discuss. I'm exaggerating, but this is where we are. So how do we react to these challenges? And how do we put the limits to these challenges in terms of finding the right replies to it? I would like to put two aspects on the table from the outset to consider. The first one is that we are living in a period of transformational change that we have not seen in decades. There's always been transformational change in our societies, of course, and that's very healthy and that's very good. But so profound, so quick, and so many implications that we do not master, we've never seen this before, right? Technological advancements, climate change, demographic shifts, all these are having a huge consequence for the survival of our current world order. And that you are as familiar with it as I am. And especially for those that are students in economy, we know that we have a world order that was built on liberalism and also on a set of human rights that we consider universal, and which almost all the countries of the globe, at least on paper, are still subscribing to. But this world order, as we have known it, is currently under threat. And as I've said, the attacks, the permanent attacks on the multilateral systems, the geopolitical landscape, which is becoming increasingly hostile and increasingly uncertain, and we come back to the uncertainty that I've mentioned at the outset. And also, I would say, and this is very worrying, and this is something that should concern you all as well, is that the ideals of democracy that we have always taken for granted as catalysts for social cohesion, peace, and prosperity are increasingly being questioned. And this is not something that we discuss at the ILO. This is something that we all need to discuss wherever we are and whatever we do. And so we see that this social contract of the 40s and the 50s, especially after the Second World War, which was based on the principle that citizens contribute to the common good. I mean, it can be economically, it can be socially, it can be culturally, on the assumption that the state would ensure a minimum standard of living, provision of essential social services and infrastructure, and the protection of their basic rights. This is being challenged. And this is, I'm sure in the minds of many of you, obsolete. This doesn't make any sense in today's society, because this phenomena, we also observe it in Europe. And if you're following some of the discussions about or around the elections for the European Parliament, you see that these issues are at the heart of the discussions of the candidates, at least in Portugal. So this first aspect, which a period of deep, quick, transformational change, together with the second aspect I want to put on the table, which is the fact that this accelerated transformation goes hand in hand with a loss of social cohesion, is something that should not come as a surprise to any of us. Because we know that any transition, and especially one transition as deep as the one that we are having now, is creating always winners and losers. Always. I mean, this is not new. It's as old as history. And we also know that governments, when they design their policies, this design also includes trade-offs, right? It's not black and white. There's always a trade-off on everything that we do. And it's quite clear that in a world with such a big uncertainty and with a change that is so accelerated, and with so many crises that pop up almost every day like a mushroom, make it much more important for policymakers also to look into what type of trade-offs they are ready to negotiate and to put on the table. If we zoom into the labor market, because that's what the ILO is competent for, what we see is that these transformations have a clear impact in the way our labor market functions. I mean, I don't know how many of you have already entered into the labor market, but if you have, you can observe these things every day. And what we see is that there is a transformation on the business models, on the relationships between capital and labor, and ultimately on how employment is organized, with a very clear direct and indirect implication on workers, on decent work, and even one of the dinosaurs of the past, which many of you may consider outmoded, how trade unions and employers' organizations operate, right? And again, how do we answer to this? And what should be the elements of this new social contract? When we already know, because we also observe that on a daily basis, on the way governments behave and design their policies. And its common voice is that governments, the way governments deliver today for people are in many ways not adaptable or not quick enough to answer to the pace of change. If we think how governments react to the impact of technological change, or the impact or the prevention or the way to address climate change, we see that they are very slowly in terms of reacting and designing the policies. But also we see, because I talked about inequalities at the start, that the way governments react in the face of the persistent and pervasive joblessness, or the insecure employment, or the growing working poverty that we observe in many parts in the world, of the growing income inequalities, or in the inadequate social protection, we see that more and more people are falling through the cracks. I mean, they're just not covered by anything. And they are what we sometimes call the invisible battalion in the labor market. And what we see is that this also contributes to a greater fragmentation and to a greater precarization of our societies. And let me look a little bit on what I mean by this. If we think about inclusivity, I mean, the ones falling through the cracks. In many countries, we see that there is an increasing proportion of the population that is not covered by government support or government's policies, and they do not have their rights protected. The reasons for this can be multiple. Let me just advance three. Because of their nationality, maybe. Because of the geographical dispersion, maybe. Or because of their employment status. And if we go back a little bit to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we look at the extraordinary measures that many governments put together, I would say virtually every government in the world put together, often with the social partners, with those dinosaurs, workers and employers organizations, to answer to something that none of us had a logbook to see how we should react to or how we should answer to. We saw that many of those initial answers that were put together left many workers unprotected. And we know that this was particularly severe for the workers in the informal economy. They were not protected by any of the policies. They were not registered. No one knew they existed. And often they were foreigners in many countries, or they were coming from very, very far away provinces in those big countries of the world. So we saw that this was a huge problem of those that are not covered by the government support or do not have their rights protected. And what we've also seen post-COVID is that, yes, there have been new jobs created, but most of the new jobs created on the post-COVID era, mostly at the global level, have been in the informal economy. And today, we have 60% of the workers worldwide that work in the informal economy. 60%. So what we saw with COVID is that, yes, we already had inequalities, but that they were amplified with the pandemic and with the answers to the pandemic. And this was everywhere in the world, of course, much more in those countries that have a social network that is not well developed. But also we saw cases in Europe, very serious cases of people completely falling through the cracks. And who are those? I mean, the usual suspects, right? Young workers, migrant workers, those that do not have for women, I mean, in many circumstances, on different characteristics, but also women, but especially those workers that do not have a formal contract relationship. And that's not just in the developing world. This is also in the developed world, and especially those that are outsourced workers or dependent contractors, especially in the platform economy. And if we do not make interventions to correct this, they will be those that will continue to suffer even more in the longer term. And as I was saying, very often these workers are not beneficiaries of any fiscal policies, and they don't have access to social security. I mean, another important figure that I want to leave you with is that the last ILO monitor on the world of work in 2023 was telling that the global jobs gap was projected to stand at 453 million people, and that 4 billion people are still excluded from any measure of social protection around the world, okay? So this is where we are. And yet, social protection is recognized by the international institutions and by most of the governments around the world as a basic human right. So what we see is that these workers see their labor rights, including the fundamental rights, violated every day. Most of them, if not all of them, are at the lower end of the income distribution. And when we see the prices of food and energy increasing, we see that they struggle every day to feed their families or to heat their homes in those countries that really need heating because the wages are not high enough to help them face the challenges to have a life with a certain level of dignity. So when I tell you about social justice, when I tell you about peace, when I tell you about the need to extend protection of those that are not covered by our labor institutions, is something which is crucial if we also want to address the growing conflicts and the growing consequences of the natural disasters as climate change. The last 2 weeks, what we saw in Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul, is appalling, right? How many years is it going to take for those people to get back to an ordinary life? And we will never be able to give back life to those that have lost their lives in this catastrophe. And what we see at the same time is that the gross inequalities within countries has increased. We also see that the vastly unequal distribution of wealth and income between developed and developing countries is what drives the difference of income and living standards around the world. And so inequalities within and between countries have reached levels which we would have seen in the early 20th century before the 2 world wars. And so we also know, because of budgetary constraints, we have a limited capacity on the part of the public policies. And so the existing social contract is no longer good. I'll come back to the same argument. And if I add to those arguments already the fact that after decades of globalization and of trade liberalization that have to a fundamental shift of production from the developed to the developing countries with the global supply chains, we have to admit that even with all this, that has increased the living standards of many people in the developing world, getting them out of the extreme poverty, but no more higher than just getting them out of extreme poverty in many circumstances, is showing that the truly sustainable global economy is just not there. It's just not there, and we're not constructing this. So again, insisting on a new social contract based on a governance system that only supports a minority, and the minority is mostly those that are working in the formal economy and in the traditional sectors, is not just addressing the challenges we have today, but it's also perpetuating the inequalities that we already have in our societies. And in my view, what should be one of the key actions of a new social contract should be on fostering the institutional capacity and the strengths of our legal systems to cover everyone in the society, and in particular those groups that are in vulnerable situations, the invisible ones in our societies and the invisible ones in our labor markets. So if I now turn to the argument on adaptability, I think that with the megatrends that I've told you about, and I'm not going to repeat, what we need is that the policymakers and the institutions need to adapt much quicker than what's been happening so far. And I'll give you the example of technological change. I mean, innovation outplaces regulation. We all know that. And when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence, we all talk about artificial intelligence or about machine learning practices within the wider society, or more specifically in the workplaces. We see that these things are affecting our lives, and we cannot miss those changes in the way we live every day. I mean, the way we communicate, the way we use the technologies, the way we see and measure the world around us, the way our economy is functioning, but also the way, and that's the worrying part of the equation, the way we are outsourcing decision-making to artificial intelligence and to machine learning. And this is a constant debate. Where are the lines? And I think we all recognize that this creates fantastic opportunities for economic development, but it also creates fantastic challenges. Some more visible, others more hidden, as to how are we going to, in detail, look at the way new technologies are changing the way our workplace functions, for example. Or how decisions are impacted by technologies, or how workers are monitored using surveillance technologies. These are things that we don't read in the newspapers, right? It's just the hidden part of the conversation. And if we look at this in zooming in a more careful manner, we see that the way the relations between management and workers have been taking place are shifting completely with these new challenges of the artificial intelligence. So it shifts the way enterprises make managerial decisions, the way they interact with workers, the way they oversee their work. And I think that the biggest challenge, and we can dwell that later on the debate, is how information and data on the workers is collected, is explored, and sometimes even sold to third parties, and the impact that this has. And why is this happening? Because there is no proper regulation. Well, in Europe, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, but around the world, that doesn't exist. And workers today have little control about the data that is taken from them and how it is utilized. I'm not even going to dwell on the algorithmic decision-making processes regarding hiring and firing, but we can also read that in the media. So this is a real problem, and this is a real problem that can only be addressed if it is done on the basis of a strong social dialogue between employers and workers at the workplace level. And then I'm going to talk about something old-fashioned, by collective bargaining, which is the way to regulate the operations of the labor market, but also as to the way you interact with the governments, with the tripartite dialogue, because we need appropriate regulation for the way new technologies are being utilized. Another one linked to the new technologies, it's the growth in the digital labor platforms. And those are the visible ones, right? It's the Ubers or whatever the name of the platforms that we see every day, everywhere. And And here, at the same time, the unregulated nature of these forms of employment has got huge consequences on wages, on the labor rights, and on the working conditions of the workers that work in those forms of work. And again, we need to have employment relationships that cover and protect these people. Often they're even misclassified. They're misclassified as dependent contractors, and this is also conducing to labor rights violations. So we need to see how do we extend the protection to these workers. How do we extend the protection to migrant workers? A topic which is very hot in our societies these days. But what we know is that because of demographic shifts, because of conflict, because of climate change, people just move. They need to move, right? I mean, be it internally displaced person, be it refugees, be it migrant persons. We have seen that these moves have almost tripled in the last 30 years. And we also see that accompanied with that, we have a rise in inequalities because these people are not treated in the same way as other regular workers into the labor market. So this is about ensuring equal opportunities, equal treatment to everyone. And this cannot be done without social dialogue. And that's the bread and butter of the ILO. And the social dialogue is really the need to target policies, to target answers, and to do that in the best possible manner, bringing together workers and employers, because this is the only way that we can promote the fundamental rights that we all have. And this is the only way we can really provide better policies and regulatory frameworks for the future. And I think the ILO has a very extensive experience in the context of social dialogue. And bringing that experience to the Global Social Justice Coalition and to bring that experience into the way we can move forward is very, very important. And as I've said, this does not exist in other organizations of the multilateral system. And we need to make sure that we are able to define the right regulations. It's not over-regulating, neither under-regulating, but the right labor market regulations that make sure that no one falls through the cracks. And I think that this is very, very important, and a way also to revitalize our new social contract, guaranteeing that the journey towards sustainable development, because that's all we want, is done in the best inclusive manner that it is possible. I just wanted to tell you about the 2030 agenda, because that's another instrument alongside with the Global Social Justice Coalition that is very important in the capacity of shaping a new social contract. And again, if I go back to what we have said with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and link it with the Declaration of Philadelphia in 1944, the Declaration of Philadelphia of the ILO, we find very interesting similarities of what has been said in 44, 80 years ago, and what is the reality of our world of work today and our lack of social justice and social cohesion. Let me just say that in the Declaration of Philadelphia, it is clearly said, and I quote again, all human beings have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security and equal opportunity. And the Declaration of Philadelphia also talks about something that the Sustainable Development Goals also bring to us, which is the capacity to have a strong policy coherence in order to achieve the objectives of sustainable development. And again, quoting 1944, the attainment of conditions in which this shall be possible must constitute the central aim of national and international policy, end of quote. And so, where did we go wrong, right? That's the question we all need to ask ourselves. Where did we go wrong? Why are we where we are today when we thought that the 2030 agenda would be the right way to move forward? But what we see is that the SDGs are in a very dire state as we want them to move forward. I will not go into the details because I don't have time, but I just want to tell you that 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 140 targets that have been established, today, 5 years to go to 2030. Half of them show moderate or severe deviations from the desired trajectory. More than 30% of these targets have experienced no progress, or even worse, some of them have experienced regression below the 2015 baseline, and guess which are those ones? Targets on poverty, hunger, and climate action. Progress on more than 50% of the targets of the SDGs is weak and insufficient, and on 30%, it has stalled or gone into reverse. Just one or two figures. 575 million people will still be living in extreme poverty in 2030. If things go as they are going, it will take 286 years to close the gender gap in legal protection and remove discriminatory laws. And in education, the impacts of years of underinvestment and learning losses show that by 2030, 84 million children will be out of school, and 300 million children of young people attending school will live unable to read or to write. So yes, we are certainly leaving half of the world behind. And then I think that I will move on, Mafalda, because I'm well beyond my time limit. I just want to go back to summarizing what I've been saying into 2 or 3 very clear ideas, in the sense that if we look at the national legislation, as I have said, not being able to keep up with the pressure of globalization and the need to have greater efforts to strengthen multilateralism, because nothing can be solved exclusively at the national level, we quickly conclude that this new social contract would be vital to counter the inequalities and the precarity that citizens, but also workers, face in terms of their daily lives. And also that it is very, very important that we need to make sure that regulation cannot continue lagging behind and not advancing together with the fast pace of change in our labor market. So, in a nutshell, how can we address this new social contract in 2024 and beyond? And in our view, it would be to prioritize mitigating. And I'm very, very modest. I'm talking about mitigating, right? Because we need to mitigate the results of the transitions that people are confronted with throughout their lives. And we need to mitigate the inequalities that drive a fall in social cohesion and increase conflict and a growing lack of trust in institutions in many parts of the world, and we need to address that. We need to strengthen what works, and we need to see what does not work, and to make accelerating answers to the accelerating changes more quicker than we have. And we also need to make sure that social and labor policies have got to be prioritized, because those that have fallen through the cracks need those policies. And it's also very, very important that in moving forward with these conversations, we have a macroeconomic framework that links much more rigorously the social and the environmental impacts. I mean, the economy can work very well, but it does not have a direct and linear impact on the social and on the environmental sustainable development. And how, in doing those trade-offs I talked about at the outset, how the macroeconomic policies and budgets are set to do those trade-offs between multiple policy goals, oftentimes prioritizing economic growth and stability over social and environmental concerns. We cannot continue like that. We need to have the reduction of inequalities and of extreme poverty as a central aspect into our policies, and we need to have an environmental agenda that also takes its social implications and the potential negative consequences into consideration. We need to make sure that the social partners and the governments work hand in hand, no matter how much you may think this is the part of the past. It's the only way for us to move forward, because that's the only way to make sure that we are adapting our social contract on a permanent nature of time, seeing that the changing nature of the challenges that we have are very quick and that we need to adjust and to reply to that. The final thing is that this is not being discussed in a limbo. At the level of the United Nations, we have a summit for the future, which is taking place in 2024, looking at where we are today on the Sustainable Development Goals, and now we need to correct them for the post-2030 agenda. We have a high-level political forum on sustainable development, and then we have the World Summit for social development. I think all these events are very important. What we need to guarantee is that there is the political will on all those involved to make sure that we are having a change that really leads to a truly sustainable development world. Thank you very much.
We have now time for debate, for questions and answers. Please, the floor is yours. Please, I would like you to introduce you first, to present yourself, to say your name, and then to put the question. I ask Dario if you bring us the microphone. Yeah. Anyone wants to start? We have, I would say, 10 minutes for around 12 minutes to this short moment of questions. And I believe all of you have basically felt touched by this very inspiring talk. Meanwhile, until you think about the question, I just could raise one question, or two questions eventually. One is you just said, Dr. Maria and André, that fostering institutional capacities to cover the system in order to protect everyone, would be the major, or I would say the major challenge. The question is, how can we protect everyone without necessary, I would say, financial support? Is it because we know the political will is precisely to create institutions, strong institutions, to protect everyone and to create a strong social contract? But how can we do that without rebuilding the notion of solidarity? Because as we know especially from the field of sociology, but not only from the field of sociology, Émile Durkheim was one of the key authors that basically explain us how the idea of solidarity, the so-called mechanic solidarity of the 19th century, just basically transformed into an organic solidarity. So how can we do this challenge without changing our proper notion of solidarity? This would be one question. The second one, I wouldn't like to monopolize this. It is how are the connections? What kind of connections could we establish between this purpose of a global coalition for social justice, for instance, and the European pillar of social rights? It's one of the, I would say, institutional instruments for promoting social cohesion, but is it, and I know that you have recalled some ideas, the Agenda 2030 and other instruments, other institutional moments of Europe, of the European Union, and not only of the European Union, but how could we recover, how could we establish any kind of connection between the European pillar of social rights and this purpose of a global coalition for social justice? Now I've done two questions. I ask you now, what would you like to add? Please say something. So that our speaker could respond to 4 or 5 questions. If you don't feel comfortable with the English, you can.
I also understand Portuguese.
You can do it in Portuguese, okay? Because we know that we have not Portuguese native speakers. We have students from different nationalities. So feel free to ask the questions in Portuguese if you want. Okay, someone is raising the hand.
Yes, my name is Ayun Kosat. Thank you very much for this seminar. And my question is what exactly or how the new social contract will look like. And I guess it's about the rights and the demands like between the citizens and the government. So I just want to ask that question. Yes.
I think just one more. No, there's someone there. Yes.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, I am Onurhan Güngör. My question is, you just talk about the rapid change that our world is undergoing. In this type of change, I think transforming the whole system is not possible. We should also remove the old elements from the old system, like the collective bargaining you mentioned. How International Labour Office will deal with this type of old elements which comes from the old system? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that Maria Helena could start answering.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. I mean, I would just like to, building on the very last comment, you cannot throw the water with the baby, right? So there are things that we have been doing ever since the start of civilization that still make sense. And what we need to see is how far our institutions are able to be quicker in terms of addressing what is a very rapid pace of change. And they are not. They are not. I mean, if we think as to how long it takes for a government to react to, for instance, the development of the platform economy in the majority of the countries and to regulate those, we know that in the meantime, there are many people that have been overexploited. There are also many others that do not want to enter into any regulated form because they think that they are better off staying in the unregulated part of the market. So what I think is necessary is to really make sure that the society that we are building today is a society that is built on the values of social justice. I've given you some quotes of the Philadelphia Declaration or of the creation of the ILO, where we respect the human being, whether despite the differences we are able to respect everyone in the same manner, and how we can make equal opportunities equal really for everyone. And that's what we do not have in our societies today. Some are more equal than others, depending on if you enter into the labor market, the form of contract, the contractual relationship that you have, for example. It can be completely the false independent workers or the contract work, et cetera, when we know that they are doing the job of someone that should be employed by a company on a full-time basis, on a full-time wage. So there are a lot of cracks in our societies that allow for the old social contract no longer to be adapted, because that social contract was built to answer to a formal economic model, mostly, right? With a very big weight of the public sector, with less weight of the private economy, of the private sector. We see countries where there is hardly any private sector yet on the 21st century. And so we need to make sure that these new forms of informality, which also exist in the developed world, are not leaving people on the sides of the society. And that brings to the question of where do we place solidarity into all this conversation, right? And what do we do with the concept of solidarity, which seems to be spoken still, but which we don't really know what it means in the practice. I come back to the example of social dialogue, for instance, where and the use of collective bargaining as one of the most important instruments to regulate the functioning of the labor market independently from the legal regulation that the labor code should give as a fundamental protection, equal protection for everyone, but then having the capacity of having collective bargaining that regulates what are the needs of a specific sector or a specific company in a determined moment of the life of a company. That is no longer what it used to be in the past, because there are less and less interest on the part of the employers and sometimes of the trade unions, I need to admit, to regulate those things by collective bargaining, saying what we have in the law is enough. We have collective bargaining agreements in parts of the world that are a repetition, a copy and paste of the labor code. So what's the point? What's the use of having that artificial collective bargaining, which does not bring any new rights and obligations, because this is done with both sides of the coin, the rights of workers and the obligations of workers, and the rights of employers towards its workforce and the obligations of employers towards its workforce. So we need to go back to this collective approach where solidarity really has a meaning and is not an empty or a hollow shell, as we see often being the case. And this is also in terms of public policies, the solidarity that those public policies need to convey to those that are most disadvantaged, not just in the labor market, but in the society in general. I mean, the ILO deals more with the labor market conditions, but you cannot deal with the labor market conditions ignoring the overall development of a society. So the role of public policies in that matter, which also seems to be so considered as so old-fashioned in some sectors of our societies today, needs to guarantee that those that are the most disadvantaged ones get special, let's call it positive discrimination, in the way that they are integrated into our societies. So our new social contract must absolutely take into consideration how we can reform our existing labor institutions and social institutions in order to make them more responsive to what are the needs of the economy, yes, but also of the persons and of the environment at the same time. And at the same time, it needs to be able to regulate to cover all those that are completely out of the system. I gave you the example of the 4 billion that have no social protection coverage across the world, for example. And that's a good example. I mean, is it something that we as Portuguese, or being a foreigner living in a country like Portugal, can imagine? That in this world that are 4 billion people, many of them that have not one single form of social protection. While we say that social protection should be with us from cradle to grave, right? And be adjusted to the needs that we have throughout our lives. And many people in the world do not have that type of coverage. So how can we make sure that public policies and our institutions have the interests of those persons at stake, at the same time understanding that the pace of change in the labor market, in the way enterprises operate, in the way they relate globally, in the way supply chains operate, in the way we are seeing moves from developing to developed, and the other way around. We are seeing a lot of developing to developed moves, especially in relation to forms of production, which are a result of the introduction of new technologies. You do not need to export many of your operations. You can keep them where you are, giving again an unbalance in the way the international division of labor is done as we move forward in that regard is something that should be, for me, the corner of this new social contract. And then, of course, you bring in the policies that already operate, which are based mostly on the respect of the human rights and on the respect of the fundamental principles and rights at work that have been designed by the ILO, which are consubstantiated on the decent work agenda. We don't have the time to discuss that today, but we don't need to invent a lot, right? We don't need to invent a lot. The basics, the fundamentals are there. How do we put the fundamentals at the service of everyone, and in this moment, at the service of those that are most disadvantaged, has got to be a source of big concern as we move forward. And you cannot do that as a government in a unilateral manner. You cannot do that as a country in a unilateral manner. You have to do that within the framework of the multilateral system, because our economies are completely integrated, either you like it or not. That's how things operate. And also, we don't want to base this new social contract on charity. We want it to be based on the right of each and every person to contribute to the common good, but to be able to receive back what they are contributing with. So it's probably a new concept of a society which is based more on solidarity and on the capacity to reply to the urgent needs and on the capacity to read that things that were true 2 years ago, I would go even further, before pandemic, and how they are today and how they need to be regulated today are completely different. So you cannot get new results or better results by using the recipes of the past. Already Einstein was based on that principle. And I think we should not forget it. For me, it's very, very important. Now, the last point I want to address is how do we place the global coalition in the context of the European pillar for social rights? Well, again, Europe, for good and for bad, because sometimes they do some things that they should not do. I'm talking about Europe, the European Union as such, has a very important role in terms of supporting the sustainable development of other parts of the world. Europe is the biggest contributor in the world to development cooperation projects. It's the ones that put more money to assist developing countries in catching up. Now, is that done because we're all good people? No. That's done because there are key trade-offs to be achieved with that, and because there is an interest on the part of the Europeans to contribute to the development of other parts of the world, not least not to suffer the big migratory pressures that Europe is suffering, although Europe needs workforce from other parts of the world, every country, right? So using Europe as a good example on, and that's why I talked about the European Parliament, what I hope will remain in the future democratic institutions, but having the European Union as an example of a democratic, institutionally based operation. Yeah, I mean, I have my doubts as to where do we go from here, but okay. I also have to respect the vote of the voters and the decisions that are taken. But Europe is still considered an example, right? And if I go abroad, and if I go, and Valentina has the same experience, or even Mafalda, if we deal with the people from Central Asia, for instance, they look at Europe as the good example, as the model, in terms of the levels of development we have, in terms of the levels of protection that we have, in terms of considering, from an ILO perspective, this moment that workers and employers organizations are co-legislators at the European level together with the European Commission and the European Parliament. That's a model that everyone wants, right? Well, while we are trying to destroy it as Europeans, right? The others are looking at Europe as being the good example on how we move forward. And I also have to admit that the European Pillar for Social Rights has been a major breakthrough for social policy in the European Union. Since the time of Jacques Delors, we did not have, at the European level, any commission that took so much risks and took so much initiative in putting, already with Juncker at the last part of his mandate, but especially now with the European Pillar for Social Rights. And I'm sure that this has got to be also transposed into the national legislation with a certain level of innovation, intelligence, and fantasy. Because what is decided in Europe is very important, but it's a minimum. It's like the international labor standards. It's a minimum, right? We need to go upwards in that regard. But it's really very, very important. And in the ILO, we use Europe very much as a sort of inspiration in terms of how we can move forward. And the European, the Global Coalition for Social Justice is very much based and inspired on what has been developed at European level. So, not wanting to be Eurocentric, but recognizing that Europe still remains compared to the rest of the world. And I'm really saying the rest of the world, and I assume the responsibility of saying this, okay? As the continent or the integrated regional process that has most advanced in terms of protecting its citizens is and will remain a model for the rest of the world, as long as we do not busy ourselves with destroying what we have done and wanting to start from scratch. And I think that's a big source of concern for all of us, but that's also in your hands by expressing the vote and making sure that the social elevator is not going back downwards and it continues to go upwards. And that does not depend on the policymakers, that depends on citizens and the vote. Which is very, very important.
Thank you very much. We're going to move now to the second talk by Valentina Beghini.
How much time do I have?
35 minutes.
Thank you, Hermes. Thanks, Vice Dean. Thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. So after this super interesting, let's continue, I hope. And my presentation today is about the latest add to this international labor law, which is the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention, number 190. I will go straight to the issue because I know that we are running. It's already 5:30. I don't want to take you here for longer this afternoon. So before starting, just a question for you. And Professor Costa promised me that it's not part of your grade for the exam, whatever. So there is no right or wrong answer, or be ashamed of not answering. So raise your hands if you have heard about Convention 190 on violence and harassment. Okay, good. Okay, no, it's good. So it's good that we are here talking about this. Do you think it applies, it relates to you in your everyday life? Raise your hand if you think yes, it does. A little bit higher your hand so you do also a little bit of exercise. Okay, good. I think, more than 1/3 of the room. Okay, so the other 2/3 thinks that these standards, this convention, does not relate, does not, I will say apply, but does not relate to your everyday life, today as a student. Okay. And last question. And here, feel free to talk. You can a little bit raise your voice, so we don't need the microphone. If I say violence and harassment at work, what comes to your mind? Immediately, what comes to your mind if I say violence and harassment at work?
Sexual harassment.
Sexual harassment. Discrimination. Unbalance.
There was a word for this. I think it was mobbing.
Mobbing, yep, mobbing. Unbalanced power relations, I heard something. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Do you think it's a problem that only a few countries have, or it's a common issue across the world? A little bit louder. I'm common issue. Okay. So it is indeed a common issue. Okay. It's a problem, a huge problem that all countries around the world have. Okay. Regardless of economic development, unfortunately, even European Union countries, although they are a model for the rest of the world, but I mean, it's widespread also in all European Union countries. And it affects everyone, okay? And when I say everyone, I really say, I mean, all people. For the time being, I will use the word people, and then you will understand why, in the world of work. Although, okay, there might be some groups, some individuals that might be more at risk, or some occupation, some types of work. If you think about, for example, what we experienced during the COVID pandemic, I'm sure that in Portugal was the same as the rest of the world. I mean, do you remember a particular group of workers that were under attack, physical attack, and subject to violence and harassment, I mean, unfortunately, on a daily basis? Yeah? Nurses and doctors. Others during the COVID-19 pandemic? Cleaning services, yep. Yeah, all the, officials that were doing essential services during that time. But regardless of the COVID-19 pandemic, if you think of your everyday life today, any groups of workers or occupation or type of work that you think might be more at risk of violence and harassment? Sorry? Caregivers. Also some conditions, I don't know, some characteristics or job arrangement that could lead to more violence and harassment. Yeah?
I think that something that is much more related to violence in the job space are probably the works in the under economy. I don't know how you
The informal economy, undeclared work or informal economy. Yeah.
everyone that works
In the street.
that are illegalized, for example, prostitutes in the street, any kinds of other different works without contract, these groups are much more susceptible to that kind of things to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Informal economy workers. Workers handling money, for example. That might be part, a risk that is related to the job. Working alone, what do you think? So you see, I mean, violence and harassment can affect everyone, but then there are some characteristics of the job, of the occupation, or of some particular groups that could increase the risk of violence and harassment. And this is important to understand if we want to design and develop effective measures to tackle this phenomenon, okay? We have informality. We also have, it was mentioned before, discrimination. Discrimination is both a manifestation of violence and harassment, and the colleague that just said sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is both a manifestation of violence and harassment and a form of discrimination. But it could also be one of the reasons that, underpin the violence and harassment. Racial attack. Racial harassment. Racial harassment, racism, are both forms of discrimination and a manifestation of violence and harassment. So you really see the interlink. But going back to the organization of the work, okay, some particular working condition, but also I know that some of you study cultural organization. What about occupational stress? What about the type of leadership style? The role clarity the division of tasks among co-workers. Do you think that this can be one of the factors that could lead to violence and harassment? Yes, why?
For example, the leadership style, some leaders normalize the treatment they give to their employees, like yelling at you, they consider that it's a joke, even then, but it's not really a joke and can affect psychological.
Yeah, good. Okay, so you see, there are some factors leading to violence and harassment that are related to the organizational culture, some factors that are related to the working condition, some factors that are related to the actual job, occupation, and some factors that are related to the personal characteristic of the person. Okay, if we want to tackle and address, talk about violence and harassment, we need to remind all of these different factors. If we think at the magnitude, okay, of violence and harassment, it's very difficult to measure, okay? Why? Because, believe it or not, violence and harassment is still a taboo. Nobody wants to talk, not nobody wants to talk, but it's still difficult to talk about violence and harassment. You fear for your reputation, you are fear of, what other people would think of you, what your family, your co-workers, even your colleagues at university, if you experience any forms of violence. The ILO in 2021 carried out the first global exploratory exercise to understand the magnitude of violence and harassment, so the frequency and the prevalence, by using the same questions around the world. And I'm highlighting this because now, when we think, for example, about sexual harassment, how you perceived sexual harassment might not be the same concept that a person working even in Norway could have, or in South Africa. Okay, there are different understandings because it relates to the culture, it relates to different factors. So the ILO, in order to have comparable data, we use the same question. And we found out that 1 in 5 people in employment have experienced violence and harassment in their life. So if you count here, 1 every 5 people in this room experience violence and harassment. It's a huge number. And this, is believed to be an underestimation. Okay, there are several reasons. We have a report, if someone of you is interested in reading it, where we explain why this could be an underestimation. But data shows that it's 1 in 5. Okay. If we divide the different forms of violence and harassment, so for example, sexual violence and harassment is 1 in 15, physical violence and harassment 1 in 10, psychological, it's 1 in 5. Okay, these are huge numbers. With, yeah?
Do you consider it harassment, for example, during the job interview, if the woman that they are interviewing is between 25 and 40, if they have the question if she wants to get pregnant or get married, it is considered a form of harassment?
This could be. It's definitely a form of discrimination. Sex-based discrimination, because it's related to the sex of the person and to the fact that that person could become a mother or could be pregnant. Of course, this is a good question, and it will come. It also depends of the legal system, but if this creates an hostile environment, okay, it could be considered a form of harassment, and if it could create a damage. But for sure, this is a form of discrimination, which is not allowed, and it's prohibited by international labor law, international labor standards. But we will come to this, because this is really important, because one could think, okay, but job seeker is not in the labor market, so it shouldn't be covered, right? Because you don't have a contract. But this is the point, and this relates with what Maria Elena was saying. Okay, thanks to this convention, even job seekers are protected against these forms of behavior. But we will come in a few minutes. I hope in a few minutes. What this survey also shows, and I think is super interesting also for your study, is that first of all there are some gender issues. I mean gender analysis of the forms of violence, in the sense that this study confirmed that women are more exposed to violence to sexual violence and harassment. Okay, although many respondents refused to answer to this question. Men were more exposed to physical violence and harassment. And when we think about psychological violence and harassment, more or less they were equal. Okay, so this is an important feature to consider, particularly when we design policy to respond to this. What it also shows is that, do you think that, okay, I will stop making questions, otherwise we won't finish. But violence and harassment does not happen in isolation. Okay, this research shows that more people, the majority of people interviewed, or 3 out of 5 victims, okay, experience it multiple times, which is worried, because it means, okay, we don't know if it was in the same employee, with same companies, but it means that, you know, it's something that does not happen in isolation and only once. It also confirmed that there are some groups more at risk, and these groups include youth, migrants, and wage and salaried workers. Among migrants, even among migrants, for example, migrant women were more exposed compared to migrant men. And for example, among women, okay, migrant women were more exposed compared to non-migrant women. What does this tell us? It talks to us about the existence of what is called intersectional discrimination. So people who have different identities, okay, are more exposed to this kind of unacceptable behavior. It also shows, because we did an interested comparison, that persons affected by discrimination in life, so it could be education, public housing, bank, whatever. I mean, anything which is not related to work. So persons who were affected by discrimination in life were more exposed to violence and harassment at work. This is important, and because it says that the continuum of discrimination and violence and harassment between society as a whole and the labor market, and how, first of all, the labor market can be a game changer, okay, but also how we need a systemic change to tackle these issues. And the last few points is that I was saying before, only basically half of the respondents talked to someone about their experience of violence and harassment. And you know, I mean, when we say someone, okay, the top answers were family, friends, someone external to the work. Okay, so, and why they didn't want to talk about it? Because they fear, first of all, they thought that it was a waste of time. Nothing will change. You can talk about it, but nothing will change. Second, for fear of their reputation. And third, because there was unclear procedure at work. Okay, so this to give you a little bit of context. And what is the impact? Violence and harassment has a huge impact, first of all, on a person's health, dignity, on the family and social environment. I mean, it goes without saying that it's a violation of human rights, of the dignity of everyone, of your safety, health. It threatens equal opportunities because, I mean, people can be, you know, cannot be willing to join or to stay in the labor market if they are afraid to be victim of violence and harassment. And this particularly applies to women or other groups more at risk. Is incompatible with promoting sustainable enterprise. It impacts workplace relations, okay, productivity, enterprise reputation. So And all in all, it has an impact on the individual, on the community, on different level. I put some number, but we will share the PowerPoint. It has also a huge cost in terms of productivity, but also in terms of social services. Okay, this is just to give you an idea, but it's really a huge cost for the societies. These are not ILO numbers. It's independent research carried out also by well-known research organization. But it's just to say that it is a huge economic loss. So this is to say, how did we get to this Convention 190? So I don't have time to go through the entire history of 105 years of ILO, and you will get, it will entail a full course of lectures. But as Maria Elena was saying, since its foundation, the ILO was interested in protecting the dignity of workers, okay? And of course, also the safety, health of the people. We have different instruments, including convention and recommendation. Just a quick question. You know what a convention is, right? I give it as, public administration. Silence means consent. Do you know? Yes? Yeah, please, go ahead. Okay, it's an international treaty, okay, in international law. And when it is ratified by a member state, it becomes binding, okay. The ILO, okay, has a normative function. So governments, employers, and workers' representatives, okay, through social dialogue, and we will see it quickly in the next slide, agreed to legiferate, to regulate a specific topic, okay, through conventions, which are, binding text when ratified, recommendation, which are not binding text, but provide guidance and on a specific topic, protocols, and then there are other instruments. But for our purposes, it's conventions and recommendation. So in 105 years of life, the ILO has adopted several conventions and recommendations that somehow were dealing with violence and harassment. Okay, we had convention on discrimination, we had convention on occupational safety and health, we had convention, for example, on domestic workers, where they talk about the abuse, violence, harassment that domestic workers face during their work, the Indigenous and Tribal People Convention that they talk about for the first time about sexual harassment against those populations. So we had, the migrant convention, migrant workers convention. So we have different treaties, okay, different types of international law. What was missing was, an overall framework, okay, because through these decades, okay, the international community, workers, employers, governments realized that the topic of violence and harassment was very complex. There were different factors. Meanwhile, there was in the society a movement, if you remember, was the Me Too or the Black Lives Matter, okay, that were denouncing this behavior also in the world of work, okay. It started as a need to have a new law at the international level to protect particular violence against women, okay? But then during the discussion, they realized that not only women experience violence and harassment at work, that this is an issue that relates to the dignity, safety, and health of everyone in the world of work. That's why the approach changed, and from the initial, discussion on gender-based violence and violence against women, the International Labour Organization turned into violence and harassment in general, tout court. So this is very quickly the process, and it's a process basically depicts what is the social dialogue at the international level. Okay, this is the standard, how a standard setting process. What is a standard setting? The process that leads to an international treaty for the ILO, a convention. You see that it took basically 4 years, okay, during these 4 years, there were several meetings with governments, workers, employers, representatives come, discussed. There were questionnaires sent to 187 countries. Try to understand what they think about the topic. The ILO produced reports and research to understand what is the law and practice in all these countries. Because when you do an international law, an international treaty, it needs to be applicable to 187 countries. So what does it mean? That first of all, we need to know what is the situation, and you need to provide and to write it in a way that it's flexible and that could be applied in all these contexts, which have different cultural tradition, economic development. Okay, so it's really a long, in-depth process, and which require a lot of discussion and compromise between the 3 parties. Why the 3 parties? Because workers and employers eventually are those who know the reality of the world of work, and their voice is key. So this is the topic, this is the process, and it was adopted in 2019. And they were adopted by the large majority of what we call the International Labour Conference, which is basically the parliament of the ILO, okay? And as I said, Convention 190 is an international treaty. Portugal, by the way, ratified, okay? And Recommendation 206 provide guidance to its implementation. It was adopted on the occasion, on the year of the centenary. And it was also a strong message that the ILO constituents, so governments, employers, and workers wanted to give to the world, to say, let's start this second centenary of our life with a strong message that everybody's dignity at work needs to be respected, that the world of work needs to be built on a mutual respect of everyone's dignity. So here in the picture, okay, you have representative of workers, employers, and governments. It was the very moment of the adoption. I'm not sure we'll have time for a short video afterwards, but it's really nice. I will share it with you because I think it will give you a feeling of what happened in that moment. So just to go quickly, what is important and why they relate to you today. These are the first international treaty that establish clearly the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. Okay. It's the first international treaty that defines what violence and harassment is. Okay. And here is the definition of violence and harassment. You will see that you don't find any of the specific manifestation of violence and harassment that you mentioned earlier, except the sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is there. But you don't find mobbing, you don't find bossing, you don't have physical violence, you don't have any forms of violence and harassment. But you have a definition that says that violence and harassment is a range of unacceptable behavior, whether single or occurrence or repeated, that cause or might cause harm, whether economic, physical, psychological, sexual, or economic. Is the perpetrator mentioned in this definition? Do you have the reference to the perpetrator? No. What is the focus? The focus is on the harm. This is what is called a victim-centered approach. So in order to have violence and harassment, okay, first of all, the behavioral practice needs to be unacceptable and it needs to cause harm. And violence and harassment also include gender-based violence and harassment, which is violence and harassment directed at person because of their sex and gender, and includes sexual harassment. Here I want just to highlight that the definition mentions persons. There is a strange understanding, at times, also in the international community, that gender-based violence and harassment is only violence against women. It's not like this. Gender-based violence and harassment, is against men, but is beyond, the binary definition and understanding of sex. And this convention, for the first time, defined gender-based violence as violence and harassment which is directed at person because of their sex or gender. Whether sex is the biological characteristics and gender is, the social role, the construction, what a society think a man or a woman could do. So this is a very broad definition. And this is what everyone in the world of work has the right to be free of. But when I think about everyone, it goes to who is protected. This is a very broad scope because everyone who is in the world of work is protected. Everyone who works irrespective of their contract. So no need to have an employment contract. If you are in the informal economy, as your colleague earlier was mentioning, platform economy, dependent contract, people working in, as a self-employed, job seekers, the question earlier, okay, job seekers are job applicants. So people that are trying to enter the labor market. Apprenticeships. I don't know if you have already started doing some apprenticeship during your studying, but if you work as an apprenticeship or as a volunteer, in any organization or you are covered. It covers also employers as a physical person, so exercising people that exercise the duties and authority. And why this? Because it wants really to protect everyone. And it wants also to protect from all forms of violence and harassment. Can be horizontal, so from your supervisor to the co-workers, but also the other way around. Vertical and horizontal between co-workers. But it also protects, and this is why it also relates to you today, okay, also from violence and harassment from third party. You are a third party for these employees sitting next to me here with your professor. And you are protected, you are included in this convention, both as a victim, because you could be a victim, and unfortunately there are some news, in many countries around the world, but also as a perpetrator. So this convention applies and takes into account the role that third parties can have as a victim and perpetrators in creating a world of work free from violence and harassment. Think about when you go to the post office, how you treat the person that is giving you the service, or to the restaurant, or the waiters got your order wrong, and they start screaming, and perhaps she's a migrant or he's a migrant, so some racist comments. This is prohibited. This is included and prohibited by this convention. This is how this convention, even if you are not in the world of work yet, although perhaps you are job seekers, but you are considered as a third party. And governments who ratify this convention need to take measures that also address these issues. So world of work, sorry, it will take longer. World of work is not only the traditional physical workplace, but is wherever you are because of your work, basically. Are you on WhatsApp with your teamwork, team from work, and there is sexual comments that you don't like? This is part of the world of work. Are you in a Christmas dinner organized by your university? This is part of the world of work. Are you in a training? Are you commuting? Do you think that when you come from home to the office, let's say that you're working, is part of your world of work? Yes, no, yes, no. Could be. It is. This is another innovative element of this convention, okay, that relates to the protection of safety and health. Even the commuting, okay, is part of it. And then you can ask me, okay, but how can the employer, protect me if I am on a public bus, if I'm in the metro? And Maria Elena knows very well that this was a question that came up many times during the standard setting process. This is another beauty of this convention that requires governments, employers, workers, and their respective organization to take measures based on their responsibility and nature of their control. So if you think recently, many governments, even in Europe, have, for example, adopted legislation on street harassment in public spaces. Okay, to protect from harassment, from violence that happens when you walk in the street, when you are in a public bus. Okay, this is part of government measures to protect and to ensure that your right to be free from violence and harassment when you go to work is ensured. And there are many also, companies or that applies collective agreements. For example, there was an example in Kenya, Egypt, that they have done collective agreements or they put, with the measures to protect in the bus, when we are in the buses, to protect the workers, but also to protect the users. So the world of work is very broad. What is another innovative principle of this convention? That is framed and is grounded in a rights-based framework. This convention clearly says that if you want to get rid of violence and harassment, first of all, you need to implement, respect, promote all fundamental principles and rights at work. What are they? Who want to try? Elimination of forced labor. Elimination of child labor. Freedom of association and the right to engage in collective bargaining. Right to equality and non-discrimination. And the right to safe and healthy working environments. These are the 5 fundamental principles and rights at work. Do you want to get rid of violence and harassment? First of all, continue promoting this. Why? Is child labor, in your opinion, a form of violence and harassment? Yes, no, yes, no. There's no grade. Okay, forced labor. Let's try with a simple one. Forced labor is violence and harassment. Is anyhow related to violence and harassment? Yes. Right to equality and non-discrimination? Tick, 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 tick. You can call home, like in those. It is. Freedom of association and the right to engage in collective bargaining is strictly related to violence and harassment, and not only because the trade unionists are subjected to violence and harassment. And this could be, a risk factor. But also because there is some research, a lot of research say that where workplaces are unionized, the rate of violence and harassment decreases. Child labor. Child labor is related to violence and harassment, is violence and harassment. So, do you want to tackle the violence and harassment? Governments, employers, and workers continue to promote the fundamental principal rights at work. But also decent work condition. Decent work. A decent work that, ensure that you have a decent, treatment at work. Why? Because there is research again. Talk about the informal economy. For those occupation sectors where decent work conditions are not guaranteed, the rate of violence and harassment is higher. Okay, so it's strictly related. And this is, a strong and powerful message because it shows you the interrelation between human rights and all the system to protect workers. So it also bring together the words of non-discrimination, occupational safety and health. What does it mean? organizational culture. This convention says that violence and harassment can be prevented. You know, when we talk about stress, so there are some, through occupational safety and health, you manage the risk that have a bad impact on your health. This convention says that you can also prevent violence and harassment. This is a shift a little bit, because in the past, violence and harassment was particularly sexual harassment, gender-based violence, and other forms of discriminatory violence, has a post-factum approach. Okay, there is a victim, let's provide redressal mechanism. This convention says, wait, we can prevent all forms of violence and harassment. And how we do this? By integrating all the risk that lead to violence and harassment, and by integrated violence and harassment per se, into the occupational safety and health management. By saying to the employers, okay, you manage ergonomic, you manage biological risk, you manage other hazards, you can also manage and minimize the risk of violence and harassment. This is key. Very quickly, okay, this convention also called for an inclusive, integrated, and gender-responsive approach. Okay, it's a huge innovation, because it says that there is no. First of all, we need to be inclusive in the sense that everyone needs to be protected, people in the formal economy, regardless of the contract, but everything needs to also be accessible. Integrated. Since the scope of protection is so broad, both the material and personal scope of protection, we need different entry point. We can have labor law, we can have equality, we can have occupational safety and health, collective agreements, okay? And we need prevention, we need enforcement, and we need awareness raising. Okay, we need to have different entry points, and all of them need to go together. And gender responsive, why? Because we need to tackle the symptoms. We cannot tackle only the symptoms, but also the root causes. And we also need to consider that women and men have different needs. And if we want to really address them, we need to really, first of all, design measures that take this into account, but also that eradicate what perpetuate this kind of violence, including harmful social norms, cultural norms that perpetuate any forms of violence and harassment. All this need to be included. Of course, these require a whole-of-government approach. Okay, we need coordination, and we need different roles. Also, we also need, and you will see, I'm sure this is clear, it's not a one-fits-all solution. You mentioned before, the violence and harassment can to protect caregivers or to protect nurses and doctors might require different measures than protecting people in the agriculture or people working on a boat in the maritime sector. This is very important, and how to do it? Through social dialogue, through having workers and employers sitting together, because they know the sector, they know the working condition, they know the risk, and they know the best way to address it. This is why in all the convention, in all the principles, say in consultation with workers and employers. Okay. Very quickly, these are the three pillars. I think we are out of time, so I will skip all of this. But this is the convention is very rich in terms of prevention, protection. It has a lot of measures, enforcement, remedies, and guidance and training. This is the three main pillars. Just one word of what for me is one of the innovative elements is that this convention also tackles domestic violence. Why do you think domestic violence? In the past, domestic violence has also been considered something that is, relegated within the whole of a house. It's not something that the world of work, employers and workers need to think about. For the first time, this convention recognized that domestic violence has an impact in the world of work, and that the world of work can do something to mitigate its effect. Unfortunately, one of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic highlights is that it really shows clearly this relationship. Because during the COVID-19 pandemic, cases of domestic violence, there was a spike in cases. And of course, it has an impact on the world of work. How does it have an impact in the world of work, in your opinion? Do you think that a victim of domestic violence is 100% productive? Do you think she or he might need time to go, for example, to see social services, to see doctor, to go to the tribunal, to take care of the children? Yes, no? Yeah. Do you think that the victim of domestic violence can be even afraid to go to the usual place of work because it's where the perpetrator can find him or her? Exactly, yeah. Sorry? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that this could also create a risk to other co-workers? Example. A victim of domestic violence works as a cashier in a supermarket. The husband goes there very angry, and I don't know. There was some, and it shoots. It happened in the US many times. Do you think this creates a risk for other core workers, or only the victim of domestic violence is affected by this? Sorry? Yes, it does. Domestic violence also creates a risk for other co-workers, okay, and for the victim. So for the first time, okay, this convention recognized that, yes, there is a link between domestic violence and the world of work, and the world of work can do something, okay? And this convention requires governments to take measures, okay, to mitigate its effect. Of course, it doesn't ask employers to act, as it was said during the discussion, as a therapist and doing couple solving problems, psychiatric or psychologist. No. But what can the world of work do? It can provide leave for victims of domestic violence to attend courts hearing, for example, to see social workers. It can provide, to flexible working arrangement. It can provide also temporary protection against dismissal, because the victim you cannot be productive if you suffer domestic violence at home. Okay. It could include domestic violence in workplace risk assessment. What does it mean? When the employers put in place measures to mitigate the risk, I said before, ergonomic, whatever, also it could include domestic violence. What can it mean? In many countries, for example, in the case of the supermarket, having a picture of the person, or make sure that, nobody enters with some other, things that could harm. Okay, these are measures that could be taken into in practice, and of course awareness raising. So this is a very important element of this convention. So I'm done. I'm sorry for the long discussion. So progress, where we are today. So it was adopted in 2019, and so far we have 39 countries that ratified. The 40th is on the way, so it will be during the conference. We have a lot of new laws and regulation, and this is good. Okay, we have also new awareness among young people, among everyone. Okay, and it's becoming, which is very important, not only a women's issue, but a safety issue for everyone. We are seeing, and this confirms what Maria Elena was saying, that collective bargaining agreements are emerging as the best way and a powerful instrument to tackle this issue. Okay. We did some research, and in 15 countries, I mean, the majority of provision were in collective bargaining. So this is something to consider. The challenges, of course, data collection, of course, again, awareness, also overcoming taboos in society. Okay, there's nothing to be worried or to be fear of. I mean, it's not the victim's fault. And this is what we hear a lot of time. Okay, so talk about it, speak about it, and create an environment where everyone feels safe also to talk. It also, now the challenge is to build the capacity to implement such legislation. And this requires a whole of society approach. That's why also the recommendation talk about the role of schools. Okay, for example, it suggests to have gender-responsive curricula or violence and harassment mainstream in all curricula, in all grades of education. The role of media, how media portray instances of violence and harassment without depicting the victim as, you know, as it was their fault. So it's a societal change. And that's why we need all of us, we need all of you, because it's true that it's a right of everyone, but this convention says that it's a right, but all of us has a duty to refrain from any acts of violence and harassment. So I will stop here. Apologies if I went quickly through many slides, but I hope it was clear enough for you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We still have a short time, I would say, of 10 minutes for questions and answers for debate. So I believe that now you are much more familiar with, comfortable with this dialogue between the audience and the speakers. So please feel free to demand any additional clarification. It's a question about enforcement mechanisms. Yeah. So, any more questions? So, one there, Christian. Yeah.
Yes. You mentioned about how companies can support the violence that individuals are suffering, right? But how about the managers? How can the government make sure that the managers will follow the recommendations given about the rules and so forth, all the bullet points that you mentioned, right? Because I think that the government should protect as well the employees by promoting self-defense in these cases. In a conversation with management, these two people in one single room, whatever is being said there is going to give the reason to the manager. So how is the government promoting this self-defense between the employees and the managers who have all the control within the company?
Okay. Any more questions? No?
I have one.
Yes, please.
You were mentioning that one of the pillars of the convention is guidance and training, and I'm guessing, I would like to hear you more on that, because you mentioned the prevention side of the convention, and so as employers, we are also looking for best practices and how we can be proactive in avoiding, identifying, and dealing with these kind of situations in the workplace. So I wanted to hear more about that.
That's enough. I would just to add, the institutions for fiscalization, let's just say the authority on labor conditions, for instance, that we have in Portugal, what is the role of those institutions in terms of regulating those processes? Because they intervene in labor market in order to prevent, I would say, the risk situations, and how is it predicted, the role of those institutions of prevention, of authority on labor conditions? I would say it I think this is the correct word in English. Because, in fact, we are talking about different sources of violence. That's why it's interesting, because you have mentioned domestic violence. It's internal violence on one hand, but there are other kinds of violence on public places, but also other kinds of violences which are on public places but are hidden forms of violence. For instance, the forced labor, we know that exists, but sometimes it's basically hidden from the audience, from the public. So it is not regulated. So how would you intervene in all those kinds of situations?
Thanks. I will try to reply to all this super interesting and not easy question. So on the enforcement, we have the enforcement at the two levels, I mean, international and then at the workplace level. International, I mean, well, when a country ratify a convention, okay, the ILO has a supervisory mechanism in place. What does it mean? Okay, that on a regular basis, okay, it depends on each convention, it has to report what it has done in law and practice to implement the convention. Workers and employers' representatives can also submit their, reports saying what the government has done, but which kind of violations are still there, okay, and to give their overview. Okay, there is an independent, okay, monitoring system. It's called a Committee of Experts on Application of Convention Recommendation. Now, I will focus only on that. There are others supervisory mechanism, but for this convention, let's and given the time, so it's made up of 15, if I'm not 15, no, independent law experts, okay, and on a regular basis they assess the reports submitted by the governments and also the social partners, and provide recommendation or direct observation, okay, to the governments. So they're asking for more information. They give recommendation to align what is the situation in practice or in the law with the convention. Of course, there is no enforcement in the sense that the ILO or the supervisory mechanism cannot come to a country and, because, I mean, there's the principle of sovereignty, okay? But this entails a process, okay, that, hopefully lead to change in laws and practice. For the most severe violation, there are other procedure that could lead to other forms of commission of inquiry or other forms of not enforcement, but of supervision, okay, that could push through a process of moral suasion, but at times, it goes also beyond the moral suasion with the penalties and the sanction that could lead a country to make a change. I know that Maria Elena has a very strong experience and larger experience than me on this, but yes, there is a process. There is also a process in the international law with other human rights mechanism, because the ILO convention are also, some of the rights are also human rights, and so other human rights mechanisms that also pick up of this violation, and we could have also other human rights bodies, urging the governments to make actual steps towards the modification in law and practice. Of course, the ILO Convention, I mean, this is 190. I mean, not all are up to date. Some have been abrogated because, I mean, they're not acceptable anymore, or they are outdated. But it covers a different, range of issues from working time, protection of maternity. Some have sectorials, we have convention of nurses, on domestic workers, on maritime, you had last year. So it's a different subject. And all the different subjects, also for new conventions, are decided by what is called the governing body, which is basically the executive power of the ILO. And they decide the new topic on what they would like to regulate. For example, this year at the International Labour Conference, which, as I said, could be the Parliament, we will discuss biological risks. Next year, we will start a standard setting process on platform economy, decent work in the platform economy. So the variety of issues are different and are decided by, through social dialogue by workers, employers, and government's representative. When it comes to the workplace level, the issue of unbalanced power relations between employers and workers, was at the origin of what is the labor law. Okay, so the need to protect the weakest part of the employment relationship. We have different mechanisms. So labor inspectors could be one of these, depending on the size of the employers. The importance of workers' representative and trade union representative in supporting, the employee, which is in a weaker position towards the employer, to state their rights and not be, in a power of weakness. So this goes back to what Maria Elena was saying. The role of trade unions, the role of collective bargaining, the role of social dialogue. Because, we talk about, not the theory, but the international level, the big framework. But then when you go to the enterprise level, to the workplace, they play a key role in promoting the rights of employees, which are, the weakest part, the weakest of the employment relationship. Okay, so that's why it's important and it's key to keep, these dinosaurs. We can renovate, we can talk how to improve, but because this is part of their mandate, on their essence of the reason why they were born, to protect, in practice at the workplace. Of course, there might be some, small, medium enterprises or tiny employers where, you don't have a workers' representative, so the employee is alone. So how do you do it? Okay. In this case, of course, you have to, first of all, you have other entities in the labor market that could help. Okay, of course, labor inspectors, but you have labor administration, but you can also go to external, to the trade unions that could provide support. Could be legal support, services, other forms of support to help you and to help the person in having the rights guaranteed. I'm not sure if I answered, but so yeah. Guidance and training. The convention, it's part of this integrated approach. So the convention just call, governments to make sure that violence and harassment is it doesn't say mention. Let me write it is addressed in relevant national policies. Okay, what does it mean? That it's, there is this understanding that, it's a labor issue, so it's only labor law, or it's employment policies. We saw that violence and harassment is bigger than that. It's a societal problem, okay? And we need a societal change, okay? Second, in any case, there are policies which might not be, focusing only on labor market, but that have linkages with labor market. Think about migration plan or discrimination action plan, gender equality. Okay. So the convention say, okay, all the relevant policies need take into account violence and harassment in the world of work. But governments needs also to provide guidance, they need to provide tools, need to provide materials, for employers and workers on how to implement it. And I have to say that many countries are doing it. Okay, also the ILO has also produced a lot of materials that could help in this. So it's a matter of making sure that employers have the tools to make this in practice. And of course, it talk about awareness raising, but then if you look at the recommendation, which is very rich on this point, is mention all this guidance training for other actors in the world of work that could have an impact. So judges, labor inspectors, media, journalists, schools, okay, because you are students, but you are the workers of tomorrow, in the sense, basically next week, if you graduate. So it's the convention say, we cannot expect that, workers in the first day of work, basically, okay, they know everything. Particular also, sorry for making, I'm not trying to simplify, but I'm trying to see the role of also schools, education in preparing and in building the future workforce to be respectful of each other's dignity. Okay, so this is what the convention is saying, because it recognizes this is a problem that requires a societal response. But of course, we need help from the governments in the sense to put in place these measures. So this is and there are a lot of sure. And the last is on the. I'm not sure I got.
Labor inspector.
Okay. Work
and conditions was labor inspector.
Labor inspector. Yeah. Of course, it's one of the challenges. Labor inspectors. In many countries, but many countries, perhaps the majority, are understaffed, under-resourced, and they do what they can with the resources that they have. But of course, and it's part of this guidance, awareness and training, how we sensitize them to make sure that they have the instruments to tackle violence and harassment, to recognize, and to provide with the employers and workers with the right measures to overcome this. Okay, so this is, I will go the floor to Maria Elena, and thanks.
No, I don't want to, let me just add one thing, because we were talking about the role of Europe compared to the rest of the world on this. This is one area where in 2007, so how many years? 12 years before the ILO approved the ILO Convention, at the European level, in the context of the negotiations between workers and employers at the European level, we have negotiated a framework agreement on violence and harassment at the workplace. The convention is more advanced, of course, but the basis of the convention has very much been what had already been a bipartite between workers and employers at the European level on this text. And let me just say it's not a directive, but the fact that it is an autonomous agreement by the social partners does not mean that the social partners at the national level, that are all signatory to this agreement, do not have to implement the principles that are included on the agreement. And the main concern was what was rightly said by Valentina here, is the fact that the preventative aspect of this is very important. And just like we also did a framework agreement on stress at work, which I expect one day the ILO will be in a position also to have a convention on work-related stress. And just like we had since 2004, I think, a framework agreement on telework. So when all the teleworking started with the pandemic, at the European level, this is a matter that had already been discussed by the social partners and regulated by the social partners, up to the point that the Commission now is considering transforming that agreement into a directive. Just I wanted to bring this enlightenment to say, in Europe, on many areas, we're much more advanced, and we have much more instruments then for the implementation than other parts of the world. Sorry.
No, you're right. Thanks for this. And also, what the research that I mentioned about, collective agreements. Actually, majority of those that, I mean, there is this research, we shared the report that say in 15 countries, the majority of provision dealing with violence and harassment, both prevention and redressal, are found in collective agreements. And don't think that all these collective agreements are being adopted and agreed upon in the last 5 years. I mean, they are far older. So that's to say that collective agreements, social partners, because this is their daily life. I mean, these are the problems that they're facing every day. They had already, even before the convention, recognized and put in place measures to solve it. So that's it.
Thank you very much. I think that the Vice Dean would like to say something now to conclude, just to say that you have something to the.
I, first of all, ask for 2 more minutes of your attention. We have some gifts for our speakers today, but before I hand in, I give our gifts away. I just wanted to thank again our speakers for this wonderful conference, very enlightening, for your presence here, and hope that the collaboration between the University of Coimbra, here the Faculty of Economics and ILO continues for many years, because I feel that we all came out of this session much more enlightened and better prepared to be good workers, good employees, and good third parties as well. So I'll just hand out the gifts before Ernst can...
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for all your attendance on the session.